Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Xevious, a true arcade classic. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Namco, Xevious originally released to arcades in 1982. Over the years, it's seen ports to so many different systems, notably the Famicom in 1984, and now today in 2021 to the PlayStation 4 and the Nintendo Switch. Now this is a title that many agree is one of the most influential in shoot 'em up history and really video game history, just due to several of the firsts that this title brought to the industry. The scrolling backgrounds for vertical scrolling shoot 'em ups up to this point were largely just star fields, and here we suddenly have this more realistic textured background that is flying over. And in addition to that, it also introduced a certain type of boss to video games in the form of its Fortress and/or Genesis. Now, that with those pieces of information said, it's definitely one of those that I feel belongs in any shoot 'em ups fans collection, be it this version or on any of the various Namco collections. This is one that it's not necessarily the arcade archive version, but it's one I feel that belongs in any shoot 'em up gamer's collection. So starting the game itself, we're taken to the screen here, which allows us to start with either one or two players. It is two-player alternating, and in the emulation here, it does an interesting thing that kind of I think is neat. It doesn't serve much for purpose for playing the game in a modern setting, but it allows you to flip the screen for the second player. So if you were playing this on a tabletop arcade machine, you'd flip it, and then the second player would have a correct view of the screen. Just a neat little fact. Starting the game, we're taken to this nice little forest flying over it in the Solvaloo, the ship from Xevious. And it's one of the things that I think is pretty awesome about this game. So there's quite a bit of enemies, sprites, and really everything in this game has a name. All of the 26 of the enemy sprites are like a name. They had code names and final names that they released, and it's just a kind of a neat little fact of development all these years later. The gameplay itself is relatively basic by today's standards, what was pretty neat at the time. So another innovation that this one had is you are attacking enemies not on like just a single plane, but on two planes. Oh, in reality, it's all like drawn on the same plane, but so you've got enemies that are in the air, and for those we use the air zapper. Then we have enemies on the ground, and for those we use the blaster, which is just a bomb that arcs down and destroys an enemy over where our crosshairs are. So in addition to that, one thing that's neat about this emulation, so those two in the arcade would have been their own separate button. The arcade emulation adds both of them bound to the same button, which I do appreciate. There is the ability to turn on rapid fire, as seen here. That doesn't change the speed at which the blaster fires. That's basically set. But it does change the speed of your zapper shot. But as you can only have so many of them on screen at once, I feel like the rate of fire that the game has for its default rapid fire is actually kind of ideal. So that's would be the way I'd recommend you play it. From a scoring standpoint, it's actually relatively simple once again by today's standards. All the enemies have a default point value, and so there's no like multipliers or extra ways to earn like bonus points. That kind of scoring and design like philosophy would come into play later. Oh, so these enemies here I think are super neat. So it's not possible to destroy them. They're impervious to the Solvaloo's 2 attacks. But they are amazingly polygonal at a time where I'm sure game developers never assumed that we would be designing games that were like pushing like insane numbers of polygons. So to see that kind of like a design attempt made in like the early 80s is just like, man, that to me, that's really awesome. So, a little bit about the design itself. The game has a total of 16 areas that are kind of chained together. And with the checkpoint system, the way that one works, should you die, if you've made it through 70% of an area, then it would set you to the next area. This being done to help the player feel a sense of progression and to mitigate frustration from a constant loss of life. I think it was a really ingenious way to do checkpoints for an early arcade shoot 'em up. So this game does also have standard style checkpoints, so you'll be, or not checkpoints, extends with extra lives basically that you'll see throughout the course of your gameplay. The first one of which comes up at the 20,000 point mark, and then there's different point values after that. So, although not like a bullet hell, I do feel that there are some rather tricky and difficult areas to navigate through where the game itself can be challenging. And one of the first ones we have is coming up shortly in the form of the game's boss, and/or Genesis. As I was mentioning in my introduction, that's largely recognized as one of the first bosses in video games. So that alone makes this super notable. So you've got this one little block there that kind of signifies that. So this is that fortress and/or Genesis, and it's a really interesting design. So you can't damage it with your air zapper. You actually have to damage it with the blaster, which means getting close to it. But because of the way the fire pattern of the enemies is around you, it's actually fairly difficult. Although once again, similar to the checkpoint system, if you've survive it long enough, it will ultimately time out and withdraw, allowing you to progress further in the game. Just some a nice little bit of design. So as far as the minus flavors, one of the biggest issues I do take with Xevious is its soundtrack or lack thereof. You really just have one track that's playing constantly, and also the sound effects of the shots itself definitely get a bit monotonous. Although there is a certain nostalgia present there if you've ever been to arcades way back in the day. This is probably a soundtrack you would have heard playing somewhere in the arcade. It just is one of those classics that so many arcades had, and once again, as I was saying earlier, for just reason. This truly is one of those influential titles that I believe deserves its place in gaming history, and it's just, well, one that I feel every shoot 'em up fan should spend at least a little bit of time with. So with and/or Genesis down, the game progresses onward, and really there's so many titles that you can even just see the direct influences of this one from. One that immediately springs to mind, Twin Beat, with the bombs and the way that even some of the stages look. You can just it's one of those where you can tell the influences, and that's not a bad thing. So you go and have all these ideas that bring forth better and more interesting gaming, and really If it wasn't for Xevious and titles like it, we probably wouldn't have the awesome shoot 'em ups that we do today, or that have come out over the years. We wouldn't have had like the development of the bullet hell shoot 'em ups. Maybe even like some of the horizontal scrollers wouldn't have been like what they were. I mean, eventually, like, somebody would have like thought of these ideas, and we would like see them in some form. But I do appreciate what we owe to this title. All right, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.